Morning, everybody. July 22nd, 2026. Hydro with you here again. And today's message is about radio firmware lockups and all kinds of stuff. Um, Recently, on the Taskforce Roll that I just came off of, I had multiple engines. And even my task force leader had it was an older model radio, but still, it was like having all kinds of issues. And all of these people have one thing in common. They got a clone. And they got a clone from BKRs to KNG models, which that's bad voodoo right there. And I'll get into that in a minute. But the biggest problem is that firmware is out of date. People are not checking their firmware. Radio techs, check the goddamn firmware. Make sure that what you're putting in radios is compatible with the stuff that they're going to be sending it to. I see this time and time again. I got one radio tech in our area who I think is absolutely fantastic. He comes out, he's good, he thinks about it, he'll listen to what you're saying, and then he'll tailor things the way that you want them. But outside of that, we'll leave it there. Anyway, so what types of problems can be caused when cloning different types of BK radios with firmware mismatches? Okay, so now this is a big one because we had a radio on our task force that he would go to key up and the radio would just shut off, and firmware mismatch can cause that. And I'm gonna get into that in a minute. So cloning BK radios with firmware mismatches can cause code plug corruption. Okay, see that, and I think what I'll do is I'll show you. Well, I don't know if I have a way to do it here. So I'll probably just have to describe it. Let me get to that in a minute. You can get source clone errors, which is a common one. So that's when you're going from a BKR or a KNG that's your source radio, and you want to take your information from this one and put it into another one. That's your destination code. 99% of you that have been in fire long, I'm not saying anything new or novel here. You get that. But for those that have just come in, and we got a lot of folks that are coming in to the fire industry that don't know anything about this or radios or the problems. So I'm saying it for their benefit. Um, so common problems across Bendix King series such as KNG, KNG2, and BKR. Okay, code plug corruption. Okay, the target radio's data set may become corrupt, causing errors to error displays like error 2, invalid perimeter file, or error 3, code plug not found. Yeah, even though it's there on the source, and when you go to send it, it'll just completely throw an error. Again, it's all due to firmware. Well, the firmware is a big one. We'll keep it to firmware right now, but you can have a cross-platform, okay? A BKR versus a KNG. They're two entirely different architectures and hardware structures, physically different. And so we're trying to take parameters in this radio and move it to this radio. And I'll show you in a second because I've got diagrams here of the two different radios. I'll show you where the problems can come into. Disabled user code guard. Cloning from a newer KNG tone pick list to a legacy radio can disable the user code guard. Okay, user code guard is another way of saying tone select. But you can have locked transmit power. Okay, so transmit power settings can get stuck. For example, when cloning a KNG to a DPH, transmit power is sometimes locked to low. So you can't change anything. Again, it comes down to the perimeters, okay, within the firmware and the radio. So the firmware tells the radio what to do with its internal mechanism, and the code plug is the perimeters, okay, of what it has. Now, volume and audio errors. Minimum and maximum volume settings might fail, causing the speaker to become stuck at a maximum volume. So even though you're changing the channel or the volume knob, nothing's happening to the volume. Back to a firmware mismatch. Channel mapping feature. So channel labels and frequencies can change erratically, or the radio might display synchronization error, okay, or synthesizer error. For more precise instructions based on your code, consider the consultant BK Technologies product portal. Okay, which is where I get a lot of my stuff from. So this is also comes down to the models of what you're cloning to. If you have BKR to BKR, obviously the problems of having or the chances of having problems are greatly diminished. KNG to KNG, KNG mobile to mobile, greatly diminished. But if your firmware is 2 or 3 steps or 4 steps out of date, now you're going to develop a lot of these types of problems. Okay. Um, is the radio displaying any specific source code error, such as source clone error? Okay. If it's a yes, a firmware mismatch can directly cause the radio to power off during transmission by capturing the radio's parameters through hardware or voltage drops, though hardware or voltage drops are much more frequent cause. Now, that's one of the things that we had going on a radio on the task force that I would just came off of, is that they were having this exact issue. Okay. They would, in the mobile, they would key up the mic and it would just shut the radio completely off. Well, a firmware mismatch can definitely do that, especially if they, I think they said they went to Florida. They got a clone down there in Florida. They came back to the Nevada area, and then I think they picked up another clone, and it just completely, so the parameter files were all out of date. And BK um, is really good at having built-in safety features so that it protects the radio's core infrastructure. Um, so can a firmware mismatch cause a radio to power off when trying to transmit? Absolutely can. I watched it happen, and we resolved the issue upon pushing firmware, updated firmware into the radio, and then updated the code plug. Problem solved. No more problems. When you clone a radio with a firmware mismatch, the software data structure layout often shifts. This causes the radio to misinterpret instructions when you hit the push to talk button. Corrupted power settings. The target radio, okay, may read corrupted code plug data as a command to transmit at an unsafely high power level or an incorrect frequency, pulling too much current and triggering an automatic internal power shutdown to protect the circuitry. Yeah, again, that's what's happened. I've seen that happen multiple times. Firmware crashing. The mismatch can cause a fatal software exception. A a code plug crash, the exact moment the processor shifts from receive mode to transmit mode, causing the operating system to shut down or reboot instantaneously. I've also seen that to where um, it will cause the radio to restart. Okay, it won't shut off. It'll blank out as if you hit a reset button. I've seen that as well. Um, So where was I? Oh, remote control head mismatch. This is a big one. So you'll have the small remote control heads on the KNG mobiles up on your dash or in your center console, but the actual physical radio core might be in the back under the seat or whatever. Believe it or not, the remote head and the core both have to have firmware programmed into them, and they both have to match. If there's a mismatch, you can have a problem between those two radios, as well as receiving a clone from another one. Um, so if you're using a mobile radio, a firmware mismatch between the remote head and the main RF deck can cause communication synchronization to drop entirely during high power transmit event, turning the radio off. And what do we always say? Communication is the number one killer. So let's stop hamstringing our guys in the field and start making sure that the radio, we're pushing the updated firmware. We're making sure that that's up to date. I update mine and all of ours all the time. Whenever there's one, I follow BK's tech bulletins all the time, and I look at the service bulletins, and I make sure that the stuff is up to date. And I almost never have problems on a fire line, but I also never or almost never get a clone. I will most of the time hand jam my stuff to ensure that I don't have communications interoperability errors or problems. If I see somebody coming out with me and they've got this spider web dongle mishmash cloning cable coming over, um, That's like a silver bullet and garlic for me. It's like, no, thank you. I want nothing to do with it. Rule out the common hardware culprits. If the power off issue persists even after fixing the code plug, the physical stress of transmitting is likely exposing a hardware fault. Now, although less rare, hardware faults can happen. Maybe there was something that happened to the radio internally. Maybe you dropped it off of a cliff, or maybe your dozer module ran over it. And even though it didn't break anything on the outside, maybe it stressed the internal components inside to where now it's exposing a hardware flaw. It is possible. Although I'm not talking about physical structural problems, I'm talking about software related problems is what I'm talking about. So now let's look at weak battery or alkaline clamshell. Transmitting requires significantly more current than receiving. If the lithium battery is degraded, or if you are using an alkaline clamshell pack, the voltage will instantly sag below the operational threshold. So that could cause a power off issue too. Antenna standing and SWR, standing wave ratio issues. A damaged antenna or a loose antenna connector or the wrong frequency band will cause a high standing wave ratio. This reflects transmission energy back into the radio. Sometimes you might hear radio guys call that insertion loss, okay? But even that's a little bit different thing. But think of it as reflective energy coming back to the radio. So it can't get it all out, but there's a problem with the antenna, so it's going to reflect that energy that you're trying to send out back to the radio, and so it can tend to overload that and shut it down, and that could be triggering a safety factor or feature, in the radio to shut it down to save the circuitry. And it can also cause it to overheat instantly or trigger a protective emergency shutdown. Again, pretty much what I just said. Dirty battery contacts ensure the gold power leads. So if you go through all of these contacts, okay, like on the battery contacts, the antenna, and the batteries, if you've ruled out these things, then it's going to most likely come back to a firmware mismatch. So let's move on to the other one. Okay, so how to fix it? Do not clone directly. If you suspect a mismatch, use the BKR5k what we call the res software, which I have on my laptop. That goes with me on every fire, no matter where I go. To read the unique code plug from the target radio first. Okay, so this is what they're saying. Plug into the res, pull the code plug directly off of that radio, and then essentially you're going to manually copy and paste that into the other radio's code plug and then push it that way. That's really the best way. And I've done that multiple times, and that usually solves the issue. Okay, but ensure both radios are updated to identical firmware versions using the official BK Technologies service portal and radio editor software. Okay, here's why. Because certain radio editor software versions are designed to handle certain firmware and code plug features. If you've got an operating system on your laptop and you want to install a piece of software, like let's say some type of a game, but if this game is requiring a certain hardware feature accessible through your operating system to tell it how to do its gaming functions, if it doesn't have it, it's not going to work. It's going to lock up and create all kinds of problems. The same thing is going on with these radios. They have gotten so sophisticated and so smart and so technology dependent on software that now they're no longer dumb, useful. They have become smart bricks, in a sense. And we're the ones that are creating the problem because we're spreading this firmware issue around like a virus. Because every time we take a radio and we go from here to that radio, we're cloning and putting our problem into a new radio. And it might work. 99% of the features might still work just fine. So the user on this one that's not used to seeing these problems, he might perceive it as, hey, there's nothing wrong. So now he's got it. Hey, I got a clone. So yeah, I got a good clone. So now he spreads it to, let's say, 5 or 10 other guys in his module. And then those guys might go, oh, yeah, okay, well, so now maybe they got a little thing. Okay, now they got a problem, but they might not be accessing a feature that shows that as being a problem yet. Well, then they transmit it to another 5 or 10 people. So you see, this is how we're having the problems. So another way to just solve the problem is to stay in class, okay? So BKR to BKR, KNG to KNG, and then mobile to mobile. Stay in class when you do the cloning. So what are some of the critical cloning issues between BKR and Series KNG P series radio? Cloning field profiles between BKR and KNG introduces significant compatibility errors because they are entirely different hardware generations. Absolutely, I've already covered that. There's a lot of stuff on that BKR that is absolutely not going to take by the KNG. The physical radio is different. So it's got like 10 programming buttons and 3 switches. And the KNG, I think, has like 7 programming buttons and 2 switches. How's this going to work? Not to mention the fact that on the BKR, the top of it has a I'll show you right here. On the top of the BKR, it's got right here Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta. So this is a selector knob for zones, okay? It's like a rapid 4 selector zone, okay? The KNG does not have that, okay? You've got 2 collar switches here, whereas the KNG has 1. So unless these devices, which most likely are addressed, and the firmware's or the radio's architecture, it's going to have a device address. That's either could be in hexadecimal, could be in binary, could be in ASCII for all we know. But it's going to have a device address. This device address, okay, is going to be entirely different than what the KNG is going to be. And so if you're going to try to push that to a radio, as an example, it can't send it because it doesn't have the location for it to receive. So, um, cloning between these 2 series can corrupt the destination radio's parameter file. And then once it corrupts the radio's parameter file on the receiving end, chances are the radio is probably not going to work after that. You're probably going to have to re-push firmware or try to send the code plug from a good stable source. The target radio often bricks into an inoperable state, prompting a hard lockup or displaying a critical system faults like error to invalid perimeter file or 3 code plug not found. Okay. Again, I've seen both of those, and what fix it is just re-updating pushing the firmware, basically doing a hard reset on the radio, and you're not going to do this in the field. You have to have REST software. Source clone error failures. Inter-series data structure differences frequently cause a target radio to abruptly drop the data stream midway through the process, prompting a source clone error or an unterminated cloning loop. Now, just because you get a source clone error doesn't mean that there's a problem with the destination radio now. It usually means that there's something on the source that the radio on the receive cannot accept. That's why the source can't continue its clone. The default 136 megahertz frequency substitution for BKR and KNG firmware architecture strictly prohibit a blank or 0 value in the receive frequency field. If the BKR source zone includes an unprogrammed or unmatched frequency row, the target KNG radio will automatically substitute it with a 136 megahertz, creating dangerous misconfigurations during active field incidents. Okay. Now, another thing that can be caused by this is that in some radios and firmware versions I've seen to where it's like if you're only programming, let's say 5 or 6 channels in a BKR zone and you send that over, then basically it renders inoperable or invalid from channel 6 through 14 or 6 through 16 on the KNG side. So you can't even get in there and hand jam it yourself if you wanted to. I've seen that on 2 radios on this last Taskforce Roll. Erratically scrambled channels capacity. Target zones assume the strict channel configuration count of the source radio. If a 5-channel zone, okay, here we go, we're talking about what I just said. If a 5-channel zone from a BKR is pushed into a KNG zone previously configured for 16, the remaining channels are instantly rendered inactive, causing channel labels and frequencies to shift erratically. Okay, and in our case, they weren't even able to be programmed in the field. I had to plug in my software and do it that way. So broken global volume caps Cross-series cloning often triggers a bug that completely overrides the minimum and maximum volume thresholds on the target KNG. The reason for this is because you can set in the software the minimum and maximum voltage. So because it's a digital function controlled through the processor, but the volume actually acts as like the final potentiometer or variable resistor, if you will, to the speaker. The internal architecture is controlled electronically. Hence the reason you would have this problem. Regardless of the software programming restrictions, the speaker can randomly jump to a deafening maximum volume setting or emit unintended adjustment tones. Hardware cable or dongle flaws. You cannot use standard legacy cables. Attempting to bridge a BKR to a KNG requires a dedicated 701 cloning adapter. Okay. Early revisions of these adapters, prior revision G, frequently fail to establish a stable handshake, resulting in communication times out or timeouts. Again, even if you have this proper cable, which our guys did, they still were having major issues and interoperability and crashes between radios because of firmware and architectural mismatches. Fact. It's just something we're going to have to deal with. But I'm presenting this so that you folks know what is happening and to recognize it that, hey, most of the time you've either got a corrupted code plug or you've got somebody that cloned you from a firmware that was either out of date to what you have or you're out of date to what he had. Either way, the firmware series is out of date. Um, the safest way to build your profiles is never force a direct cable clone from a BKR to a legacy KNG series. Instead, open your radio editor in the radio editing software, pull the master code plug file from the BKR and pull a clean template from your target KNG. Manually select and copy and paste zones. Yeah, I've done that multiple times. That is by far the best, safest, and it's not the fastest, but it's the safest and it's the way that guarantees that you're actually going to be able to get this done. And actually, if you go in and you update the code plugs um, in the software, it doesn't take that long. It's actually pretty good. For in-class cloning, the same model radio KNGM 150, how many versions of firmware can be out of date before a problem arises when receiving? Okay, before receiving a clone from a BKR, because let's face it, even I do. It's like a BKR 5000 going into the KNG 150. It's like, okay, um, one revision, okay, and it should say it here. If BK Technologies ecosystem protocol, the severity of cross-generation cloning issues relies on major block revisions rather than a sequential count of incremental software patches. For a legacy KNG M150 mobile radio to successfully process an active zone clone from a modern BKR5, the target KNG M150 cannot lag behind more than one major firmware block. For example, keeping it within the 5.7x or 5.8x era before encountering critical failures. So the firmware compatibility threshold. Okay, so I thought I would include this for some folks here. So the safety zone with one major version block, if your BKR 5000 is on its standard stable operational firmware such as 5.8.x, whatever that X being whatever the version is, and your KNGM 150 is running 5.7x, the data matrix remains largely linear. Okay. The active zone transfer via the BKR701 cloning can successfully execute basic frequency mapping. Emphasis there, basic frequency mapping. The danger zone in 2+ major version blocks behind, if your M150 is operating on ancient 5.5x or 5.6x, okay, which I ran into on this last roll, it was never updated. It lacks the modern variable length code guard pick list and database structures natively assumed by the BKR series. So again, BKR has this stuff, but the mobile M150 is not updated to be able to look for that so that it can receive it and put it in its proper place. Um, Attempting a direct field clone to these older versions immediately triggers a catastrophic handshake breakdown or file structure misalignment. So why version counting doesn't work? BK Technologies frequently releases point patches 5.8.1, 5.8.8 to fix specific hardware quirks, control head bugs, or GPS tracking strings. Missing a few of these minor incremental will rarely cause a field clone to fail completely. That's why um, you can have like a 5.79 versus a 5.713 and it not be a critical failure. But it's when you go from a 5.6 to a 5.7, now we've got a big block. Now that's where we're introducing problems, okay? Um, Instead, look out for architectural shifts. A failure point will manifest instantly if the clone crosses a major feature boundary. The emphasis there is it crosses a major feature boundary. Code plug matrix scaling. Newer firmware change the length of tone pick lists and channel profiles. Pushing a BKR zone that references a tone index beyond the memory capacity of an old KNG firmware will force a code plug crash, leading to error to invalid perimeter file. Okay, so remote control head syncing. On the M150 mobile, the firmware of the remote control head must sync with the RF core deck. If the radio core is heavily outdated compared to the incoming clone data, the command head will disconnect or lock up entirely on the reboot. Okay, how to check and clear the gap before trying to connect the cloning cables in the field. Check the firmware versions on your KNGM 150. Turn the radio off and then press and hold the middle side button. Turn on the hand mic, or on the hand mic, okay. And uh, power the unit on. Scroll to the software field to view the exact installed version, okay. If the software reads 5.7x or below 5.7.x, bypass the field cloning process, connect to a PC directly via a core program, and manually migrate the channels to prevent breaking the radio, okay? Or bricking the radio. Are you checking a fleet of radios or anything else like that? So those are the basic critical things to look at when it comes to radios. On the KNG radio, it may be kind of difficult to see, but here we have the collar switch on the top of the KNG radios and two switches. You've got two side program buttons right here, and then this is where your speaker mic and your cloning cable goes. Um, and this is just the diagram of it, and then this is what I was getting at here. Okay, on the KNG portable radios equipped with 7 programmable control buttons and 3 programmable switches. Okay, now on the KNG, you've got 2 collar switches and 3 programmable buttons on the side. But you can also access down here, you have 10 programmable control buttons and 2 switches. So you see right off the bat, the 2 radios are built fundamentally different. So when you try to clone from one to the other, this is where you're going to you're liable to end up having your problems at. And on that note, that's basically it. Update firmware, go to bktechnologies.com and look at their service portal. And they've got all kinds of service bulletins and tech documents and user manuals. And it's all there for free. You don't have to spend any money for this stuff. But if you go and get it, it'll make radio life a hell of a lot easier for you. That's it. Cheers. Have a good day.